Lessons 50 and 51 of the History of London. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Ruth Golding. The History of London by Walter Besant. Lesson 50. The Terror of the Plague. Part 1. You have seen the city as it appeared to one who walked about its streets and watched the people. It was free, busy, and prosperous, except at rare intervals, when its own internal dissensions, or the civil wars of the country, or the pretensions of the sovereign, disturbed the peace of the city. Behind this prosperity, however, lay hid, all through the Middle Ages, and down to 200 years ago, 4 great and ever-present terrors. The first was the terror of leprosy. The second, the terror of famine. The third was the terror of plague. The last was the terror of fire. As for the first two, we have seen how lazar houses were established outside every town, and how public granaries were built. Let us consider the third. The plague broke out so often that there was hardly any time between the 10th and the 17th century when some living person could not remember a visitation of this awful scourge. It appeared in London first, i.e. the first mention of it occurs in history, in the year 962, again in 1094, again in 1111. Then there seems to have been a respite for 250 years. In the year 1348 the plague carried off many thousands. In 1361 it appeared again, in 1367 and in 1369. In 1407 30,000 were carried off in London alone by the plague. In 1478 a plague raged throughout the country, which was said to have destroyed more people than the Wars of the Roses. But we must accept all mediaeval estimates of numbers as indicating no more than great mortality. With the 16th century began a period of 160 years marked with attacks of the plague constantly recurring, and every time more fatal and more widespread. Nothing teaches the conditions of human life more plainly than the history of the plague in London. We are placed in the world in the midst of dangers, and we have to find out for ourselves how to meet those dangers and to protect ourselves. Thus a vast number of persons were crowded together within the walls of the city. The streets were all narrow, the houses were generally of 3 or more stories, built out in front so as to obstruct the light and air. There were many courts in which the houses were mere hovels. There was no drainage. Refuse of all kinds lay about the streets. Everything that was required for the daily life was made in the city, which added 1,000 noisome smells and noxious refuse. Then the plague came and carried off its thousands and disappeared. Then the survivors went on their usual course. Nothing was changed. Yet the plague was a voice which spoke loudly. It said, "Clean yourselves. Cease to defile the soil of the city with your decaying matter. Build your houses in wider streets. Do not shut out the sunshine, which is a splendid purifier, or light and air. Keep yourselves clean, body and raiment, and house and street." The voice spoke, but no one heard. Then came the plague again. Still no one heard the voice. It came again and again. It came in 1500, in 1525, in 1543, in 1563, in 1569, in 1574, in 1592, in 1603, when 30,575 died, in 1625, when 35,470 died, in 1635, when 10,400 died, and lastly in 1665. And in all that time no one understood that voice and the city was never cleansed. All that was done was to light bonfires in the street in order to increase the circulation of the air. After the last and worst attack, in 1666, the city was burned, and in the purification of the flames it emerged clean, and the Plague has never since appeared. The same voice speaks to mankind still in every visitation of every new pestilence. It used to cry aloud in time of plague: it cries aloud now in time of typhoid, diphtheria, and cholera. Diseases spring from ignorance and from vice. Physicians cannot cure them, but they can learn their cause, and they can prevent. The Plague of 1665 began in the autumn of the year before. It had been raging in Amsterdam and Hamburg in 1663. Precautions were taken to keep it out by stopping the importation of goods from these towns, but these proved ineffectual. Certain bales from Holland were landed and taken to a house in Longacre, Drury Lane. Here they were opened by 2 Frenchmen, both of whom caught the disease and died. A 3rd Frenchman, who was seized in the same house, was removed to Bearbinder Lane, St. Swithin's Lane, where he too died, and then the disease began to spread. A severe frost checked it for a time, but in March, when milder weather returned, it broke out again. The disease, when it seized upon a person, brought upon him a most distressing horror of mind. This was followed by fever and delirium. But the certain signs of the Plague were spots, pustules, and swellings, which spread over the whole body. Death in most cases rapidly followed. Some there were who recovered, but the majority gave themselves over for lost on the first appearance. Many of the physicians ran away from the infected city. Many of the parish clergy deserted their churches. The Lord Mayor and aldermen, however, remained, by their presence giving heart to those of the clergy and physicians who stayed, and by their prudent measures preventing a vast amount of additional suffering which would otherwise have fallen upon the unhappy people. End of Lesson 50. Lesson 51. The Terror of the Plague, Part II. In the month of May it was found that 20 city parishes were infected. Certain preventions, rather than remedies, of which there were none, were now employed by the mayor. Infected houses were shut up. No one was allowed to go in or to come out. Food was conveyed by buckets let down from an upper window. The dead bodies were lowered in the same way, from the windows. On the doors were painted red crosses, with the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." Watchmen were placed at the doors to prevent the unhappy prisoners from coming out. All the dogs and cats in the city, being supposed to carry about infection in their fur or hair, were slaughtered. 40,000 dogs, it is stated, and 200,000 cats, which seems an impossible number, were killed. They also tried, but without success, to kill the rats and mice. Everything was tried except the one thing wanted, air and cleanliness. At the outset a great many of the better sort left the city and stayed in the country till the danger was over. Others would have followed, but the country people would not suffer their presence, and drove them back with clubs and pikes. So they had to come back and die in the city. Then all the shops closed. All industries were stopped. Men could no longer sit beside each other. The masters dismissed their apprentices and their workmen and their servants. In the river the ships lay with their cargoes half discharged. On the quays stood the bales unopened. In the churches there were no services except where the scanty congregations sat singly and apart. The courts of justice were empty. There were no crimes to try. In the streets the passengers avoided each other. In the markets which had to be kept open, the buyer lifted down his purchase with a hook, and dropped the money into a bowl of vinegar. Many families voluntarily shut their houses and would neither go in or out. Some of these escaped the infection. The history of one such family during their 6 months' imprisonment has been preserved. They thanked God solemnly every morning for continued health. They prayed 3 times a day for safety. Some went on board ship, and, as the plague increased, dropped down the river. The deaths, which in the 4 weeks of July numbered 725, 1,089, 1,843, and 2,010 respectively, rose in August and September to 3, 4, 5, and even 8,000 a week. But it was believed that the registers were badly kept, and that the numbers were greater than appeared. Every evening carts were sent round, the drivers, who smoked tobacco as a disinfectant, crying out, "Bring out your dead! Bring out your dead!" and ringing a bell. The churchyards were filled, and pits were dug outside the city, into which the bodies were thrown without coffins. When the pestilence ceased, the churchyards were covered with a thick deposit of fresh mould, to prevent ill consequences. It was observed that during the prevalence of the disease there was an extraordinary continuance of calm and serene sunshine. For many weeks together not the least breath of wind could be perceived. When the summer was over and the autumn came on, the disease became milder in its form. It lasted longer, and whereas at the first not 1 in 5 recovered, now not 2 in 5 died. Presently the cold weather returned, and the plague was stayed. They burned or washed all the linen, flannel, clothes, bedding, tapestry, and curtains belonging to the infected houses, and they whitewashed the rooms in which the disease had appeared. But they did not take steps for the cleansing of the city. The voice had spoken in vain. The number of deaths during the year was registered as 97,306, of which 68,596 were attributed to the plague. But there seems little doubt that the registers were inefficiently kept. It is believed that the number who perished by plague alone was at least 100,000. It is easy to write down these figures. It is difficult to understand what they mean. Among them, a quarter at least would be the breadwinners, the fathers of families. In many cases all perished together, parents and children. In others the children were left destitute. Then there was no work. There were 100,000 working men out of employment. All these people had to be kept. The Lord Mayor, assisted by his aldermen and 2 noble lords, Albemarle and Craven, organised a service of relief. The King gave £1,000 a week. The City gave £600 a week. The merchants contributed thousands every week. And so the people were kept from starving. When it was all over, Pepys, who kept his diary through the time of the plague, but was not one of those who stayed in the infected city, notes the enormous number of beggars. Who should they be but the poor creatures, the women and the children, the old and the infirm, who had lost their breadwinners, the men who loved them and worked for them? The history is full of dreadful things, but this amazing crowd of beggars is the most dreadful. End of Lesson 51. Recording by Ruth Golding.